So, fire when ready. Let's get over here.
Am I close enough to the mic?
Yeah, you're fine. This is very small.
This is a piece called Drive, It Said. And it has a couple epigraphs from, actually I have 6 epigraphs, and the 2 I'm going to use for this reading. One from the late, great pitcher from the Boston Red Sox, Bill Lee, otherwise known as the Spaceman. He said, "When you're a shoo-in, your other foot can really fuck up." And the other one is from Samuel Beckett, from the last long sentence in his great soliloquy, The Unnameable. He says, "The place, I'll make it all the same. I'll make it in my head. I'll draw it out of my memory. I'll gather it all about me. I'll make myself a head. I'll make myself a memory. I have only to listen. The voice will tell me everything. Tell it to me again. Everything I need, in dribs and drabs. Breathless. It's like a confession, a last confession. You think it's finished, then it starts off again." Drive, it said. I was in love with a song, kept blurting it out, didn't know the words, maybe something about gazing at stars. I do that too, the constellations like old friends. But I might have been in a hot desert wearing snowshoes. The song would not let me go. I was like someone in love. That was the name of the tune, in fact. I played it on the trumpet for the ghost of Kenny Dorham, even missing the highest note out of respect for Kenny's flat-on-his-ass style. This song was leading me to something, wasn't it? There was no love in my life. Or there was love. Children are loves. Brothers and sisters and old friends are love. Even the dog is love. But when the fire in the hearth goes out, there's no love. No love served at the table. Time to get up, time to leave. My candor is true, even if my art is grave. Certainly, there was no feeling of new love, no baptismal lifeblood romance excitation stirring up the emotions, the months plodding by, celibate eternities curiously bearable. Like an experiment in sensory deprivation, these months would go on the soul's resume, though I didn't feel noble, strong, or medieval. Rather sad and exhausted. It's hard to swallow a family. Tough to cling to what is no longer there. I could ask for a show of hands here. Yeah, I could ask for a show of hands. Hollow at the center of the chest, my lungs, and underneath the shirt, my heart hurt. It was a constant pain. It wasn't painful, it was ponderous. I felt closer to everybody on the street, to the people I didn't know, the disfigured and halt, the guy with a huge goiter on his neck standing with his little dog on the storefront sidewalk. I felt tender toward the scruffy kids in the neighborhood whose fathers were in jail or drunk, people who'd gone through it or were about to. It hurt to see them, one big unhappy family starring everyone. I was poised on that point where measurement fails, the body clamped in on itself, bruised. The little light pleasures of taste and sound were difficult to endure, hard to put 2 or 3 thoughts together, reason through an essay, move from sofa to chair and back, finally standing up to wolf down a sandwich. Single people always eat standing up at the sink. Just as love compels me to this dialect says, take a walk, drive around neighborhood, look at houses, their stiff faces, their colors, their porches, if any, glass and windows divided into panes, smoke from chimneys, formal snow shovels. So much was up in the air, so many moments I'd turn to a last falling leaf or a dashing cat and want to speak, say, what's up, or where are the boys? Elements of an unraveling tale written by squirrels in the circular sockets of a brain. I was eager for duties, for the demands of a job, contact with real people around a real table. I am literal, lived in. To think out loud is not to say much until it's written. Give me a life in turmoil so I can feel what size brushstrokes will convey its portrait, the set of jaw, eyes the way the painter saw them, slipping. Homemade tapes accompanied my long commutes. Driving was music. Music never sounded more fundamental, like a dictionary come alive. It entered bodily. It was purposeful direction, all touch and go. I didn't know any teenage girls flipping out, didn't have to include that sound. Sometimes silence and the humming car would take on the shape of domestic anger's impossible, heavy life injustice. No one to blame. Not even myself or the culture. A vicious spear thrust into the shell of the alien other. It hit me. I closed up around it, a sea anemone. Why do we hold on to the pain, perform heroic measures to sustain an embalmed identity? Why not melt into it and notice a seagull's beak? Or I would begin to flirt with desire for the very change I feared. To be free of the rasps, to be on my own again, be my own boss, make my own cliches, hang my own pictures, dial my own information. Less security, but more adventure. Less friction, more desire. Click the lights off, knock back the heat, and slip upstairs to read late into the night. A light that disturbs no one. A few pillows behind the back. A notebook on the nightstand. You can see me here. I'm covered from head to toe. It's an 18th century classic. It's a copy of Tears on My Pillow. It's the neo-wave of the present. I'm wide awake. There's so much to read, so many sentences to speak out loud, words to prowl. The bedside clock ticks. It's a different tune. It sings, "Take care of yourself and get plenty of rest." Then sleep like a sponge drops, sops up awareness. Involuntary muscular jerks unkink the self. A distant voice whispers, "Take the night off, lonesome. You can't just have these emotions. You gotta pay for them." I was like someone in love, falling asleep alone, but only like. There was no one there but memory, but fear. Cold mornings, the sun would tip through the east-facing windows and arrive on my skin, all but extinguished. The light bouncing off the snow was a screaming vitamin. And curious people would tour the little house. It was amusing. I didn't own it. Things began to fill it. Tables on loan, sofa too. I'd be self-conscious, apologize for the bow in the shelves containing the poetry books, made them myself. The rooms so small, my eyes could travel the spines. I could jump out of bed and reach a volume of my choice and be back under the covers before the mattress knew I'd left. Sometimes I think everything I know I've learned from poems. Then I wake up. I see whole rooms exactly as they were, filled with paintings. I think I'm still in them. The Malevich room at the Stedelijk in Amsterdam. It's a space station on the trajectory of abstract painting. I sit back down and watch it orbit. It's supreme. My dreams these mornings weren't spectacular. Some revenge, some lust. But the big gnawing fact, relentless and obsessive, was there to greet me at dawn. A broken record. A tape loop. In the video version, the fact planted its green flag in my face. I was its imagery's victim. Even as the credits went rolling by, our distant vows went back into the can for the next night's showing. Beginning, middle, and end. Finito. History. Join the club. I bought a TV set and played the remote buttons like a thumb piano. It broke the silence. It lit the walls. And at dusk, I'd say to myself as I reached for the lamp, "Light the first light of evening," in stentorian tones, or his gorgeous self-pity. So much for darkness then, but the darkness was only more apparent in the lamplight. I couldn't see where I was going. The body, my own, the room like a cage, moving from chair to sofa, legs tucked up under for warmth, a blanket, a magazine. I was 85 years old. I was 15. A manuscript was my Afghan, a pile of mail, then the hop-up adrenaline of a phone call. Let's have another show of hands here.
Ignore phone call, start recording here, go back and cut off at beginning of
My Dreams.
My Dreams. Okay, I have a copy of this poem, so that'll help.
Oh, you do?
It's in that anthology.
Oh, yeah, that's right. My dreams these mornings weren't spectacular. Some revenge, some lust. But the big gnawing fact, relentless and obsessive, was there to greet me at dawn. A broken record, a tape loop. In the video version, the fact planted its green flag in my face. I was its imagery's victim. Even as the credits went rolling by, our distant vows went back into the can for the next night's showing. Beginning, middle, and end. Finito. History. Join the club. I bought a TV set and played the remote buttons like a thumb piano. It broke the silence, it lit the walls, and at dusk I'd say to myself as I reached for the lamp, "Light the first light of evening," in stentorian tones, or his gorgeous self-pity. So much for darkness then, but the darkness was only more apparent in the lamplight. I couldn't see where I was going. The body, my own, the room like a cage, moving from chair to sofa, legs tucked up under for warmth, a blanket, a magazine. I was 85 years old. I was 15. A manuscript was my Afghan, a pile of mail. Then the hop-up adrenaline of a phone call. Let's have another show of hands here. You've been there too. It's ringing just for you. The minuscule bag of groceries, silent rice, passing moments passing. Sponged whiteness of stove, sink, all the books filed away, the rug unwalked on, records in alphabetical order, a new ribbon, a stack of envelopes, the liquid paper crust that fell as white dots swept into the trash. I was puttering, not paralyzed. I was waiting. I remembered hitchhiking through Bulgaria with a Lebanese guy in a two-door sedan and stopping to share cigarettes in a village off the main road. People suddenly materialized. We were surrounded. They looked at our clothes. We exchanged furtive smiles, kidded with the children. Then out of nowhere, a woman advances, hands us a just-baked loaf of bread. It's big and round and solid and warm. And we are immediately touched. We thank them. I shake the woman's hand. It is calloused and rough. Her eyes are light brown. They are filled with amber lines that seem to spin, while my hands are soft and bookish. I'll sleep tonight on the floor of the train station in Sofia, use my book bag for a pillow, be up early, fully dressed still in a way. Is there still a crust of that bread? Later picked up in Yugoslavia by a Persian driving a truckload of rugs to Munich. You want to hear about this guy? I believe my senses. I finally had to escape from him in Vienna, completely unstrung me. He was single-minded devotion. We shared 5 words in English and that's all. One night at a truck stop outside Belgrade, about midnight of a moonless, starry night, we stopped to eat. He propositioned our blonde waitress. We finished the meal, and she followed us out to the truck, got in between us. We drove a mile down the road, pitch black. He pulled to the side and stopped. He grabbed a blanket from the cab. They got out. They disappeared into the featureless landscape. Is this the freebooting life of adventure so ably described in the Tropic of Cancer? Was I next? Could one say no in Serbo-Croatian? Is there a God? I can't see them out there. Then just as suddenly as the truck had stopped and they'd gotten out, she was back, alone. She was furious. She grabbed her jacket from the cab. She was livid. Her light summer dress fit her perfectly. She slammed the cab door and took off walking down the highway back to her truck stop. What had my Persian rug trucker done to earn her disapproval? He got back to the truck, threw the blanket in the cab, shrugged his shoulders, and off we drove into the night. There were borders to cross, spring floodwaters rushing off the Alps to admire. But by the time we got to Vienna, after some harrowing driving routines in dense traffic, some lane-changing leaps of faith that only a true son of Allah's compassionate protection could have gotten away with, he finally pulled off onto a side street. It was about 8 o'clock. We stopped. He said, "Girls." That was one of the 5 words we shared, and smiled, reached under the front seat, brought out a razor, a mug with soap, a brush, some cold water from a bottle, and a filthy hand towel, and proceeded to lather up the soap for his evening shave, daubing cold water on his bristly beard, and glancing over at me as if to indicate, what an evening we'll have. But listening to him pull that dull razor across his cold, scraped cheeks, I nearly gagged. He was really hacking, nicking chin and cheek, his towel on the seat I wouldn't even touch. I had to cut, jam, no time to get sick. I thanked him for the lift. He looked surprised. I was abandoning him. Where was my sense of fun? I grabbed my bag, opened the cab door, swung down, waved once, and took off walking down the street. It was meant to be. Back on my own 2 feet, and all aboard for the night train to Munich. I was on it. Now it's the next day. It's 2 in the afternoon, and I've just eaten a bratwurst and drunk a beer. I turn a corner and nearly bump into the only person I know in all of Germany, a girlfriend named Brigitte Gap with a Marilyn Monroe-like birthmark on a pale cheek, dark hair, big bright smile. I go crazy. This is serendipity writ large. Jung's magic synchronicity. We fall into each other's arms. We stare. The only person I know. How account for it? The mind entertains a wisdom that the body can't understand. People would say it takes a year, maybe 2. There was money on the table. There were things. What was spoiled needed division. A few rounds of letterhead legality meetings on creamy stationery, the feints and dodges, the disclosures, the aggressive silence, the screaming memes, the 3-piece options expert, the comma that allows, insists, demands another term. Something must follow the end of the world. This one here, the oil burner clicks on. These words cost money. It was happening to other people too. It was commonplace. You could join a group and discuss it. Commiserating phone calls from old friends long since lost track of. The word spreads. A postcard from a woman in New York wanting to meet. We've mutual friends. Let's have a drink. There's one in Stockbridge. You could drive down together. A movie nut uptown. I'd really like her. The chorus. She's just breaking up with. This is the network speaking. It's an erotic universe of random strangers coupling. The matchmakers were lighting up. They closed the cover before striking. Life could resume. Don't hesitate. Change your sheets. Act like someone in love would act. Get that bounce back into your step, kid. Talk funny again, and also nice and young. Hell sequence. It's typical though, isn't it? There's more variety in a crisis. More sense of drama in the pain of a social hello. To be on the crest of a breaking wave, but would you get smashed to the sand and ground up, or ride it for all it's worth into a new life, stolen like fire from the gods, one burning finger at a time? Drive, it said. Digitalized, access, therapied. The talk in every cafe on Main Street. This is our human universe, the glue on a chipped cup. This end that signals a new beginning is the cheapest gas in town. I drink it myself.
Five, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Parallel bars. It gets bad, and then it gets worse, and then the bottom falls out. But then it gets better, even great. You think you're there, but then it goes sour. Totally alone, hurting. But it comes back, new breath, friends again. It's the best it's been in months. Really clicking. It's heaven. And then, just about the time you think it's going to stay heaven, it gets bad. Then it gets worse. And then the bottom falls out. Will it ever get better? And then it does. It's even great. You blink an eye, and it goes sour, vicious, destructive. But it comes back, new breath, friends again. It's the best it's been in months. Really clicking. It's heaven, and then just about the time you think it's going to stay heaven. And this other poem is called On Laid Paper for Louise Hines. With the taint of a progressive sophistication, we recognize the yellow petals blackening, the cobalt bowl seeming to concentrate the room's noon light like a mystic who believes in nothing. But chic again this season are the sandals that leave the heels at every step. And lately, I'm not too shy to sing. I kiss your ankles like a baritone on his knees, even when they're sporting socks. Your walk complements the sheer funk I feel in air because you and you alone have a curious respect for the way your legs are fastened on. I take a measure of my seriousness from those legs and from the small of your back where I plant the asterisk of my hand. From your unparalleled collection of pie tins, sawhorses, and power tools, all connoting cool and savvy and job well done, I derive my inclination to strip off the layers of ancient paint that clogged the pores of the wood that makes up the door these words would open, not just a crack, but a new world threshold whose meanings we don't bother with yet, so busy are we with putting leftovers in the omelets. Even the weather is red, as leaves blow into the house through this door, beautiful contorted things we sweep into a pile and ditch. There are some situations from which we are not rescued, just plucked out. And if for a while I merely watch you work, it is simply to admire the curator of a backyard garden. But now you're mincing garlic and ginger. You're distributing napkins around a table as if tossing off opinions on the firmness of vegetables, the pleasure of good reception. the effect of Mary had a little lamb on the singing habits of nuns. With an agile boot, you scoot the fallen apples onto the lawn for mulch, because legible nature is your text, your accidental perfection. Then raindrops and clothespins fall to the ground. Candlelight falls on your earrings. All right angles are the same to you. Ikebana with paring knife, your eye cocked back to see the whole arrangement unfold. It staggers me to see you paint with such flush seasons, as I smooth my hand through your hair and tell you again of Jackie McLean's left shoulder and of how he hunches it up real famous when fingering his metallic-edged soloing Why Was I Born mind. I need his sound too, for don't I need all the words you make me feel I hear to deal with the pleasure of really writing you?
Good evening. This is the Incognito Lounge, the South Bay's floating poetry den. I'm Aldon Nielsen, and this week we're featuring the poetry of Geoffrey Young. When I was living on the East Coast, Geoffrey Young was, of course, one of the names that I associated with the West Coast. We've sort of traded coasts now. Geoffrey is working back east, and I'm here. But Geoffrey is stopped off the highway on his way to his sister's house to spend time with us. I want to thank you for coming by tonight, Geoffrey. The poem you just read features Jackie McLean, of course, one of my favorite musicians. And before I knew that you were going to be in the area, I had the pleasure recently of looking at a jazz supplement in the Village Voice that did something that gave me an idea for our program. It was a special of jazz poetry, and I've since done a program of jazz musicians that have included poems in their works. You had a poem in there, and I'd like to ask you to read that now. We'll hear some more of your poetry later on, but I might also ask you to, when you've finished reading this poem, to talk a little bit about your interest in music, how it affects your own poetry, and particularly your interest in Jackie McLean and John Coltrane, two of the saxophone giants, one of whom died just when I was a teenager, and the other one is still very much with us.
Yeah, this poem is called Out of This World, which was one of the tunes that Coltrane recorded a couple of times, one of them beautifully definitive, something like 1962. It's on one of the Impulse records.
Those are being reissued on CD now, by the way.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, it might be time to finally break down and buy one of those pieces. Anyway, Out of This World, it's I titled it Out of This World Fall 1965 because that's when I'm thinking back to. And there's a little epigraph attributed to none other than John Coltrane himself. These are the only words I ever heard him speak when I heard him play. And he said, "Hey Carl, these mics are doing us wrong." The deepest recesses of subjectivity blown up. We were driving from Santa Barbara to L.A. to hear Coltrane live. It was our first chance. Worried we wouldn't get a seat at the IT Club on Washington Boulevard. Mobbed, we thought. Every kid with a record player will be lined up to hear the man who stands for all that we aspire to, with his crux sound, precision, tendril, stamina. As we passed the waves at Rincon Beach, thinking back to the day a month earlier when we got run off some gorgeous 3-foot rights by, Jesus, it's Marshall Dillon of Gunsmoke, legendary square-jawed, red-headed James Arness riding a huge old surfboard. "Okay, Jem, you're the law. We'll accommodate you." Prick. Then we're chugging up, we're over, we're coasting through the San Fernando Valley, closing in. Will Aldon be there? Will Bo's fake ID pass? Stopping for gas and another quart of oil, drop off a hitchhiker who thanks us with the then common regional sign-off. Much grass. We're hoping he'll play Impressions and Naima and that immortal long intro solo on I Want to Talk About You. If we can get in, if we don't have to listen from the sidewalk outside. We're slowing down for the off-ramp, a few more unfamiliar blocks, and let's lose this oil-belching heap. Cheap enough door, but we only have enough money for 3 of the 4 of us to get in, which leaves Roger the lodger with no ID, no wallet. He didn't even bring shoes. Out. So he just walks away with a smile as Paul and Bo and I enter the IT, and the IT's almost empty. A few tables filled, glasses half drained, but no college kids from SC or UCLA. Was I wrong to think so? We're the only white guys in the place, and there are precious few blacks to hear the tenor of our time, the horn with the form to fire the brain and carve huge caverns of feeling in your chest with this lush lyric mathematics. Mais où sont les oreilles? Was Malcolm X shot today? No. World Series game on TV? Ditto. It's dark, smoky, a blues on the juke, and we sit like pashas in a red leather booth, directly in front of where the bell of this horn will be, not 2 yards away, and so close to McCoy's bench we will graph his digit audacities in dart space. Thus, sipping tiny nodes of social outrage and secret glee, we wait like sphinxes for the members of the band to emerge and ask their question, which they finally do, silently, without fanfare. Downbeat, fall on us. When with an unobtrusive lift of the horn, the quartet begins to fill the air with intricate singing figures and cascade chords stretched tune to tune, reservoirs of emotion probed more deeply than we'd ever gone. They were so endless, tunneling into ear and heart, like to transform our bodies, realign our souls, making life's absurdities meaningful by reinventing beauty, with articulated pulses from love's perfect pain, perfect annihilation, perfectly registering lines to light our speechless bodies' glowing night.
Jeff, if I can lapse into biographical fallacy for a minute, there's a moment in that poem, assuming you're talking about yourself, and that this really happened.
Of course I am, yeah.
There's a moment in this poem that reminds me a lot of a similar moment I had myself with a Coltrane record. And that's the surprise you register when you discover that everybody else in the world isn't rushing
Right.
to hear this. Did you have a similar moment with poetry?
It was tough enough getting over it in music. We were a group of friends in Santa Barbara in the mid-'60s who lived for the next record, and one of us would get the money up and buy it, and we'd all then share it and it'd pass around, and we were just living off the jazz. And the idea that the rest of the world wasn't listening at the same rate with the same degree of interest was something I learned essentially that night and other nights when it was confirmed that, it's not exactly a coterie obsession, but it's certainly not given to everyone to want that kind of intensity or that kind of immolation. And so, in poetry, I never had any big expectations about the numbers involved, or that it could support a life. I mean, commercially. I mean, when the two best known poets in America can't make a living off their writing, Ginsberg nor Ashbery, you think, gee,
But, I don't know how old you were in 65. In 65, I didn't know that. I knew that I was going to bookstores in malls and buying books by the two people you just named. So my assumption was if I was able to do this, that other people were also doing it, and these fellows were getting by okay.
Yeah.
Similar with Coltrane, the first album I ever bought in jazz was by Coltrane. And one of our sort of 60s with it English teachers decided that we should all bring a record that meant something to us to school one day and play it. And someone played something by The Who, and somebody played something by the Stones, I don't know, 19th Nervous Breakdown or something. And I marched up to the front with my newly acquired copy of John Coltrane's Ohm and set the tone arm down, and I was already looking forward to the delight that this bass-playing friend of mine would have in this record, but the record, after about 15 minutes, the English teacher took the record off, and she never repeated that experiment.
Yeah, right.
And my bass player friend was the only person who expressed any interest in it at all.
In my case, the jazz was a possibility that came out of my household.
Oh, really?
Because somewhere in the 50s, my father was reading Evergreen Review, and Martin Williams was writing beautiful essays, and he would devote each essay to one artist. So there was a great essay on Miles, and there was another great one on Horace Silver, and there would be, mysteriously, my father would provide in this house Kind of Blue and Round Midnight of Miles, two classic Columbia albums. Right. And then about, I'd say, 4 or 5 months later, there would be the first 3 Blue Note albums of Horace Silver, and that just started happening. Then I think back to when I was a young kid, my earliest memories of music were of popular American music. And I think my earliest memory of actually looking at a record, I must have been 4 or 5, and it was the purple label of a 78 record of Nat King Cole singing Nature Boy, which I think then one of my brothers or I actually sat on and broke. But because they were
Nature Boy,
they were given to break those 78s. in the same way that when we were old enough to buy records, and I was born at 44, so by 53 or 54 I was on to music, and I remember owning a copy of Rock Around the Clock in 78. And that just shows you that it was right at that pivot where the little 45s came in and began to dominate the market. And I remember coming home from school and just going straight to the tone arm for relief, and I'd play Little Richard or Chuck Berry or a black group called the Medallions doing a song called Buick 59 that I thought was the hippest thing since, tuna fish. And
wait, what?
You got to hold me on that one. So the music right away was something that just seemed balm.
Again, the poems you've read have mentioned both Jackie McLean and John Coltrane, who've been probably influences to as many poets as they have been to saxophone players. Do you take them primarily as an example of a life in the arts, or do you try to take things from them formally as well in your writing?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think initially it's just enough to hear them and let their story kind of enter, and the feelings that they generate, I think they broaden your emotional base considerably. So one then, I think, can perceive one's own life from a degree of feeling or intensity of perception that they can call into being. Formally, I would never try to imitate a saxophone's line, because I'd be doomed in advance. But improvisation is the subject we're really going to talk about. And in what way is writing improvisatory? I think almost always, and every time out, you sit at the typewriter and you haven't got a direct, clear story to tell, but you discover it in the telling. And in that telling, there's bound to be all kinds of moments that are sheer kind of balls to the wall improvisation, and where you're taking chances and you're going places, and the language is half dictating the direction of the writing, and then whatever override and intention you can supply is the other half. And then through successive rewritings, which I really kind of know that the live jazz musician cannot rewrite on the stand, so the sheer elegant mind presenting itself in improvisation of the jazz musician was the highest ideal against which the writing could, attempt to, mirror that some fact.
Well, that's one of the reasons I was interested in the piece that was in the Village Voice. I've sort of made a hobby of reading poems that announce themselves as being jazz poems, and a lot of people seem to think that they're writing a jazz poem because they mention a jazz musician, or conversely, a lot of people try to imitate some kind of sonic qualities of jazz, but again, your poems seem to be taking the lesson of improvisation much more.
Or in my instance, I don't know that I try to imitate jazz rhythms or try for particular variations on the theme like a jazz musician might try, but I'm only trying to get a story over in that Coltrane poem, and because at one point you are 21 years old and you are going to hear your hero for the first time, and that's kind of a touching period in a person's life. Later in life, your heroes are very different. First of all, most of them end up being dead, and dead sometimes for 2,000 years or 4,000 years, and your pantheon changes. But when you're a kid and you're alive, there's some man 37, 40 years old who's kind of achieved the pinnacle of his art, exerts an enormous, mysterious, like fatherly pull. And I know an awful lot of people in the 60s had that with jazz musicians. And then of course, the music scene changed with his death in '67, and then other musics became interesting too. Certainly the white rock scene and other things.
Speaking of improvisation, I do want to ask you about your work as a publisher. Of course, that's the first way I became acquainted with you. I saw a book of your poems, and then at one point, if I remember, I was ordering a book which it turned out you had published. I didn't know you were the publisher. Now, clearly, as someone who's engaged in publishing, you've had to improvise quite a bit.
Mostly financially.
Now, there was a magazine that, unfortunately, I've never seen a copy of it, but I used to see the name of this magazine in the acknowledgments of many books of poems, and that was Stooge, which you were associated with. Could you tell us a little bit about how you became involved with that, and a little bit about how it rose and fell and went on to other things?
Yeah, it turns out that a lot of poets, when they don't have a scene and they're fairly young and they need to establish some connections with older writers, they'll start a magazine. And I was pretty much around that moment in 1967 or 68 in Santa Barbara, where some friends and I got this first issue of Stooge out. The guy who was really responsible for that, who titled the magazine, was Alan Schiller, who still lives in Santa Barbara. But soon thereafter, the second or third issue, I took it over because he was less inclined to actually gather poems. He was interested in the graphic side, and I was interested in the poetic side.
Now, was this your first work with the magazine?
Yeah, I mean, never really done much. And so we really, over a period of 6 years, got out 13 issues of this magazine. And over that period, you begin to invite poets whose work you're coming into contact with. And there's this slow set of connections developing. We gave up the magazine when we moved to Berkeley in 1975 because it was just painful to continue to have to reject poems all day. Wake up in the morning and look at this pile of poems and have to reject. Or, there'd be, of course, terrific stuff you're accepting, but the pleasure was gone in that act, and what became more interesting was the thought of making a book from the poets who we'd been publishing, whose work we really liked, thinking that a book would be better for that poet's career, better for, and a longer shelf life perhaps, and would get some critical attention, whereas a magazine has this kind of short-term function of 6, 8 months.
Short shelf life.
Yeah, it brings people together who otherwise wouldn't be together, and I think magazines are terrific, and even had a dream about one the other morning. Yet another magazine was put into my hand, and I had this wonderful gush thinking, hey, there's another person out there who wants to do it, who's going to put his or her money down.
Well, some people, like the early Creeley, use the occasion of a possible magazine to get in contact with poets, and the magazine never actually appears. Do I understand then that the first books you published grew directly out of the work with the magazine?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Stan Rice's poetry we've been interested in from maybe the early 70s. He'd never had a book, so we encouraged him to give us a manuscript. David Benedetti, a prose poet from New Mexico, we were interested in his work, and he'd been in many of the magazines. He got a little 50 pages together, and we did a book of his called Nictitating Membrane. And there were other books by poets, not many of whom are so memorable now, except I think the books still read beautifully. Julia Vose was another title, poet. So then we started getting NEA grant money, and the West Coast Print Center opened in Berkeley, where there was cheap rate cold typesetting and printing available, and all kinds of publishers came together, Barry Watton and Turtle Island, and there must have been 15 publishers at the time working around there. And that's what allowed us to learn how to make books and to get them done reasonably cheaply. And that's the way the figures got kind of going.
Okay, so it was the figures at the beginning then. Now, I'm looking at a list of the publications for the figures now. It looks like we've got, 25, 30 titles now.
55.
55 that are still available?
About 50 are still in print.
50 are still in print.
I've had to reprint 7 or 8 books, and that's a big question. A book trickles out of existence, as Michael Davidson's The Prose of Fact has, as disappearing work by Barbara Einzig, and I think, I haven't got the money to reprint those, but I'd like to keep them in print. So it's all economics. I think it would be the ultimate responsibility of the publisher to keep a book in print as long as there was a desire for it. And there's a desire for those 2 books, and I haven't got the money to reprint. Though I've reprinted, 5 or 6 or 7 other books.
Although you have printed a new work by Michael Davidson in the last, about a year ago?
Yeah.
The Analogy of the Ion?
And there's one new book in the works, which is going to be out just around Christmas, by Ron Padgett, a book of poems and some prose called The Big Something.
Now, is he the first of the New York school that you sort of
actually, no,
New York school?
It's curious. I did a little Jimmy Schuyler book.
Oh, that's right. I forgot. I have that. Yes.
Yeah. I got involved. Somewhere along the line, Jimmy Schuyler's work came into my hands, probably in the late 70s.
Well, I was wondering how that came about, because I understand he's, if not reclusive, at least not someone that's seen about much.
No, he started to read now. He gave a great reading last year in New York and one in San Francisco here in February.
And those were the only 2 readings I've ever heard of.
First times, yeah. It was the one in New York was sublime, with almost every poet and writer and painter there, and it was at the Dia Foundation, and Ashbury gave this gorgeous introduction, which he said, I can't remember a time that I wasn't Jimmy Schuyler's friend. And it was just eloquent little intro, and Jimmy read beautifully, and the crowd clapped for upwards of 5 and 7 minutes, telling Jimmy, you're okay, pal, you've come through, Well,
in fact, I remember now that's the first time I corresponded with you, because you published that and had a couple of signed copies for sale, and I had been reading Schuyler for a while, didn't know anything about him, but had learned that I was unlikely ever to see an autographed book by James Schuyler anywhere, so I immediately wrote off to you and
Did you get one?
of those. Yes, I do.
Good.
Yes, I've got one of those. In fact, that's why we corresponded, because you had run out of the 10 copies that were signed on the title page, I think it was, and you wrote and said that while he was there, he'd signed a few extras, and I got one of those.
Oh, good, yeah.
So you have done Schuyler and Paget. You do have a rather eclectic list, which you arrange alphabetically.
Well, some of the poets I've actually published quite a bit of now. It turns out Clark Coolidge has 4 books, Bob Perlman 4, Stephen Roeder 3, other people with 2. This generation of writers that emerged in the mid-'70s in San Francisco, Ron Silliman, I published 2. That got very interesting as a chance to document a group of writers who were operating with some of the same aesthetic interests and assumptions. And I thought no better way than to establish the press's identity than to kind of document this burst of mid-'70s, late '70s writing.
But you have also brought together some texts that were at least fugitive for most of us, like the what we call it, collected or selected poems of Tom Raworth. The Tottering State. Yeah,
amazing book. Raworth, I just had first done a book called Ace, which was a little book, and then a book called Writing, which folds out 13 inches wide. It's a very beautiful book. Very, there's only a couple copies left. But then it seemed like Raworth was a guy, because he'd had 20 or 30 little books that no one was ever going to see. It was time at his age and given that publishing record to get together a selected. So that's over 200 pages of his work. And he didn't want to edit it himself. He let his wife, a friend of his in England, and Kit Robinson and me select these poems. And so he dedicates the book to us because we did we got into the trenches with his really wild spread of work.
Now, the book I mentioned by Michael Davidson, The Analogy of Ion, also is one of a set of books in a new format that you've introduced, these smaller volumes.
Chapbooks is what I was hoping to call them, but they end up being a little bigger.
I was going to say, the legal definition of a chapbook keeps changing. With these first book contests you see everywhere, say you can enter even if you've had a chapbook of 30 pages or less. I can't help noticing that your own chapbook has no page numbers.
I'm sure that was laziness on my part. Sometimes you're pasting up the book and you're paying attention to all the details and you think, I forgot the numbers. I forgot to get numbers from the typesetter. So I'm sure I just abandoned the idea. Plus the poems.
So you weren't trying to fool people into thinking it really was just a slight chapbook.
No, nothing intentional.
I'm going to ask you some more about that book a little bit later on, but was the idea behind this new series then to sort of put out before the public these items that are available before they might coalesce into a larger collection?
Part of it, yeah. The other thing was that I thought I could do it real cheaply.
You thought?
I thought, yeah. And it turns out they are cheaper by, at least they're only half the price of a regular book. But they don't have spines. They don't exist.
Spineless poetry.
They don't exist on bookshelves as articulately as the ones that hog a little space.
Well, that's not true. Most book dealers will not exhibit books like this face out. No. So if you don't have a spine on the book, it is hard.
I like the chapbook form, and I think the first book that I did was Melancholia, which was a 10-section poem of Clark Coolidge's that had never really been in book form, but was left out of Solution Passages, kind of a late 70s, early 80s selection, because he wanted some visuals with it. He wanted the Albrecht Dürer prints that he's really looking at when he writes this sequence, Melancholia. So I thought, I'd start there, and I did Elaine Eckley's little book, and I did a Bill Corbett book, and it is a chapbook series. I've tried to keep them essentially the same size, and I will do more, when the financial picture gets a little better. I've got my eye on the what do you call it? The private sector now. I'm trying to figure out who in the private sector is likely to be a patron of the
anyone out there in Silicon Valley is listening and wants to do something besides give computers away.
I want to read a poem, though, that's for you and your wife. Which is called the Brahms Wedding March.
Okay, well, for our listeners who don't know this, I might mention that my wife is Anna Everett, who they might hear doing the African Beat. So thank you.
Now this is not likely to have been the music at your wedding, but it just happened to be, and this was something I wrote, 18 years after it happened. The Brahms Wedding March. A ferociously large chordal force, at once slowing to stir up emotion, and raging as if to march through town. Here, listen. Boom, 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 finally subsides to slide into close-valued intervals, tripping lightly in a darting right hand, almost a dance beat, while some haltingly difficult, seriously remote and aristocratic extrusion of theory would be of no help at this point in getting the feel for this sound and space, breathing big, open, redemptive thuds. You can see the lawns been mowed, the cut flowers arranged, the sunlight involved in every twig and leaf, while Brahms pounds the present with a patina picked up in the beer hall. His star photo nodes of melody reduced to air, to disturbed air, the kind that sustains us, that drives itself to contain us, to bend, burn, and use us as its bow. For a second, and with no sense in which this isn't a continuous conversation. They're masters of the collage.
Yeah, my brother's a recording engineer there, and you're listening to 90.7 FM KSJS, the Incognito Lounge, where today we're visiting with Geoffrey Young. Geoffrey, you've introduced the issue of family with that last poem, and that follows on what we were saying about improvisation, at least in the case of my family. The work of your own that's most recently come into my hands, the volume Rocks and Deals, am I correct that some of this belongs to the work that you did at the Washington Project for the Arts a few years ago? And that was sort of a project oriented around, I don't know if you'd call it the American ideology of family or something along those lines.
They had a whole, I think, week-long series of events called Family as Subject Matter in Art. Right. And there were graphic people, there were films, and then there were
graphic
some
people.
Yeah, there were installations of paintings and so on. So that's a typical thing that Jock Reynolds used to do. Programming at the Washington Project for the Arts was come up with themes that were kind of alternative to the mainstream of painting and sculpture.
Now, when I saw you perform that, some of the photographs were on the wall as slides, and there were also things being drawn while you were performing your works. If I remember right, you were sort of mining over at the Washington Archives for photographs, and some of these now appear in the book. Is this the first figures book that has photographs in it? I can't recall.
No, actually, there's once in a while, there's a photograph here like as a frontispiece, or there'll be certainly photographs on covers. Right. And there was a book by Tom Clark called Baseball, in which there were 21 of his paintings used. So I like visuals in books, but I like them to work with the book rather quietly and not interrupt the writing too much, because the eye invariably goes to the visual over the writing.
Well, of course, that was happening when you were performing the portion of the work that I saw, at least. One thing that does not appear in this book is that was a part of that performance was yourself jumping a rope.
With an image of my parents on me as I jumped rope, or maybe Stephen Laub, my collaborators, parents or somebody, so that the image of a father on your chest as you jumped rope, or something like that was going on.
Well, also there was one point in the show, and I've always remembered this. There were photographs appearing on two walls, and you would face one wall and perform one of your poems, and a line or two in, it became quite evident that the poem you're performing actually seemed to refer to the picture on the other wall.
Very good. That's true.
We figured that out.
Yeah, that was good, because I was in that piece, I never got a chance to see it. And so I never knew whether that dislocation, where the text was mislabeling the thing it was in front of, was a purposeful attempt to get both those walls to be active, one verbally and one visually. And I never heard any feedback on that, so I'm glad that you...
Well, you did leave town shortly.
Yeah, I'm glad that actually that had a modest spatial usefulness at that point.
Yeah. Now, of course, that aspect of the work is not available in the book, but the photographs, the one with the vacuum cleaner, and the cover in particular.
That was probably in the show, yeah. We would do these photo sequences and then interlace words, so that there was a kind of a running narrative that never made syntactic narrative sense, but it was supplemented with photographs. There were a whole series of different parts of that performance piece.
And the furniture all made sense.
Yeah. The furniture was pure 30s and 40s Americana, So Yeah, rocks and deals, I think of them, and David Lehman was the guy who used the phrase in a little review in a newspaper back east. He called them free odes, in which there's no particular thematic necessity going on in them, but in my modest claim, I try to keep it interesting, sentence to sentence, without having some override thematic material. And it's the kind of writing that really drives from experiments that Ron Silliman was doing in the 70s with books like Ketchak and Chanting, where there's a kind of discontinuity between sentence to sentence sometimes, and yet this machine, this sentence-making machine, keeps generating new content.
Well, would you feel comfortable with having his description of the new sentence applied to the work you're doing here, or do you...
I would feel like these are all sentences, but I think these are sentences.
They're all new sentences.
They're all sentences in a very much more normative prose sense. I find, it turns out by the time Ron gets done making claims for the sentence, anything is a sentence, including a portion of a word. Miss, like the prefix miss, M-I-S, he would have that in a period, and that functions because it's a unit of sense. He would make a claim for that as a sentence. The old definition that had to have a subject and a verb, predicate, was just too limiting for the kinds of ways that writers were getting the sentence to signify.
Yeah.
So I was not in attempting to write this truncated sentence or a new sentence so much as just write a good, clean prose sentence and keep that attention to prose clarity alive.
I'd like to ask you to read one of those for us. I do want to mention, though, for our listeners who might be interested in possessing themselves of this work or other works from the figures, that these are available in some stores in the Bay Area, in particular at Small Press Drafting and Small Press Distribution. And people can call me here at the show at 924-4488, and I will tell them how to get these volumes, how much they cost, and where they can acquire them. Is there something from Rocks and Deals that you could read for us here?
Yeah, I could read any one of the 15. They all seem to have this kind of immense homogenized surface. But number 13 I happen to like, and I would like to add one thing that I would say about a half of the material in here is found or adapted from other sources, and about half comes maybe out of the act of writing and typing and juxtaposing sentences and finding a possible way in which you can array the work. Anyway, this starts with this. If all good things come by grace, and grace comes by art, and art does not come easy, then this sentence is a rewrite. Laughter in the quarks, not the scale of it. I might as well hang this dream for maple drip, or walk on fallen apples to moo the wash dry. A man in himself is an intersection, a sequel, a shopping mall Polaroid chromatic midget blunder charisma fantasy. The rippling body primarily a surface to be written and kissed. Peripety means a sudden change of direction in a literary work. Here, take this interspecies pill. Let life be anything and everything it is, Agnès, because language is just one of the tastes in your mouth. And your photos prove you were there, tricksy spirit. I don't know how a second violinist in a big orchestra can stand it. Out of 12 ways a certain tone can move, only one way in a particular situation is the right, enduring way. I don't want to die until I feel better, he said, but that was a flu ago. Art is life made to order. What better way to spend the electronic age? Even a simple-minded example of what missing plutonium signifies should keep us on intimate terms. And all those chickens in the barn, whose barn, what barn, my barn. The product is filial hush. All of our children are love. Even the vermiculated clarities of Jean Arp achieved their plot as sand traps. And the cheese stands alone, de furien natura bona fecit. So what is it about high tide at dusk brings the succulent seafaring creatures to the edge of the foam? Why some nights the mood's so cold the kitchen sponge shivers. When I celebrate a sleazy milieu, I aim for friendly solidarity. To be up against dishonest elected officials and skillful public relations? My boss is trying to use me to plug holes he dug long before I came along. I'm walking. This is Fats Domino talking. The first vision is of the immensity of space. The second is, c'est moi having the vision. I really teen out for it. It's just too rich to subdivide. And in the tumult that followed the explosion, she knew the place for the ideal second home, but could she figure out how to have a first somewhere? But this is 14th century wit. We were barely genes then.
Again, that was section 13 from the book Rocks and Deals by Geoffrey Young. Geoffrey, in the time that remains to us, I do want to ask you about another aspect of your work that, again, it seems like I find out about your career in bits and pieces. First I saw your book of poems, then I found out you were a publisher. One thing that's been of tremendous interest to me has been the impact of South American writers on French literary arts, something that, at least in the United States, isn't talked about much. Many people aren't even aware that L'Entremont, for example, was from South America. And some years back when I picked up the New Directions publication of the Selected Poetry of Vicente Huidobro, which one? Huidobro, okay. No accent on that. I discovered that some of the poems that he'd written in French appeared here translated by the initials GY, and of course when I finally got around to looking at the acknowledgments page, I discovered GY was yourself. And I have since learned that you've had an involvement with Huidobro's poems for some time. Is the French text only that you've translated? Or
I concentrate in the French because my French is reasonably good.
And how long have you been working on his French text?
I just had a real spurt in the late 70s. It was David Gus gave me this little book in French, and his French wasn't as good as mine. He said, why don't you translate a few of these? I'm going to do this anthology. So I did some, and then I ended up, there were 32 poems in this little book called Tout à coup, which translates as suddenly. I did all 32 of them thinking, you get hot, you just start wanting to know the whole book. And it was something I'd heard that Sid Corman of Origin magazine does. When he gets interested in somebody, he just translates a book of theirs. And so I did that book, and some of these were selected for this anthology. And there was an initial little publication that Jack Shoemaker of Sandollar did, where Michael Palmer did about 6 poems, and I did about 6, and it was a little book called The Relativity of Spring. And that's a little furtive chapbook edition
I've never seen
Sandollar did. But Huidobro, I'd be happy to read one of those Huidobro poems, and I'll restrain myself and not read it in French.
Well, actually, you can read it in both French and English. It's fairly short. Do you have the French text?
No.
No? Which one is it?
It's right here.
Let's see. Here, we've got it.
Yeah. Oh, I'll try the French too. This will be very risky. It's number 10 in the sequence of 32 from Tout à coup. Elle disait des phrases rondes comme des bagues. Elle répétait le discours des vagues. Elle parlait. Sors mon petit violoncelle. Sors mon bien lune aimée. Sors te promener comme un aveugle ou comme un épée. Monte jusqu'au dernier étage. Alors, I can't read this here. I can't even see it. I mean, I'm having trouble with this print.
Well, we'll try the English.
Cancel this shit.
Well, I'll just go around it when we do the show.
No, I mean, I can't see it. I'm having incredible... Hey, folks, I need bifocals.
Well, like I said, I'll just cut out the French part and we'll pick up now when you read the English.
Testing, 1, 2. I would have to practice the French anyway to really feel good at it. So, pause. I'll read number 10 from the sequence of 32 poems. She was saying sentences round as rings. She was repeating the discourse of the waves. She was talking. Come forth, my little cello. Come, my beloved moon. Come take a walk, like a blind man or a sword. Climb to the highest floor. Then she'll be able to say to my friends, do you know the country? I know the country. She'll tell us everything in the hushed voice of a sincere bee. Astronomic gossips of the universe with a fine taste for shellfish. Tiny record player of the beaches, jealously guarding the sea's secrets. She'll be able to tell my friends, gentlemen, the moon is unglued. I have counted all the coins of infinity. The rose missing at the pole. Here it is.
Now, you were in France on a Fulbright at one point. Was that before or after you'd done these translations?
That was before. Okay. In fact, I got that Fulbright in 1972 to do a translation project, and at the same time they asked you to do some teaching. So I was teaching at a French university, living in Paris, and trying to translate René Char, who I found at the time really too difficult for me and for my French at that period. And fortunately, the René Char industry of that period was gearing up, so I didn't need to complete that. The guy I got interested at that time was the painter-poet Francis Picabia, a friend of Marcel Duchamp. And I later, after the academic year ended, I worked at an art gallery in Paris, and so my immersion in the international avant-garde art scene was really a function of getting a job at this gallery and having a chance to travel to these big shows at Basel or Cologne or Rome. And Picabia was this companion, in the same way that William Carlos Williams can be a companion. You take a volume of his with you, and you go toward it because it's kind of grounds you in something. Well, Picabia grounded me in crazy, irrational madness and a kind of a confrontational attitude toward these received ideas of his period. And I've done a lot of translations of Picabia. But the Huidobro was just a delight to translate because he was image-based and it was clear and clean and kind of modern and discontinuous.
It's certainly taken a longer time for a Huidobro industry to emerge than it did for Char or some of the others. We hope, of course, that your full translations eventually see the light of day, but in the meantime, if people would like to read the selections that are already available, they're in the book, The Selected Poetry of Vicente Huidobro from New Directions Press, which is available in stores all over the place, even Brentano's, Walden Books, that kind of place, and contains both the Spanish and the French texts, I want to hasten to point out, in a bilingual edition.
Trilingual,
Yeah, trilingual, I'm sorry.
The thing about translation that's probably the most mysterious is not just there's a pleasure in trying to get a good English or American version of anything, but what you don't realize is that sheer demonic attention toward the text of someone else will have odd, unconscious repercussions in your own work. One time that was graphically shown me was Paul Auster, who did the big French anthology of contemporary 20th century French poetry.
From Random House, I think?
Yeah. Sent me a poem by Louis Aragon to translate. And in this poem, there was a section where it's the end of a love affair, it's been a life disaster, and he talks about the last day in which they did this, and the last time they did that, and that little litany and refrain, I translated, was an easy thing to translate. Later, I wrote an elegy about my father's death, in which I unconsciously began to use this, the last time he did this, the last time he went to the doctors, the last time he shaved, the last time he walked through the house on paper-thin birds' legs turning blue, I remember was one of those phrases, as he was, dying of cancer. So it was only later when I went back and looked at the Aragon that I'd realized I'd copped the whole rhetorical device from him. I think that's why Pound talks about translation, and what an important thing it is. You just broaden the range of moves you can make in language because you're taking in and solving other people's.
Well, Pound, of course, was alternately damned and praised for the kind of thing he did in translation. He did not attempt to provide what a scholar would look for in a faithful translation, so-called, nor did he colloquialize into American English. He seemed really to create new poems that would somehow
stand for the spirit
of the original poem, as in the River Merchant's Wife and other poems, which drive Chinese scholars mad. But
he invents Chinese poetry for American and English speakers. There's no Chinese poetry quite like that before Pound, and now Chinese translators since him have had to deal with the kinds of clarities and moves he makes. The other thing he does, his version of the Seafarer, which does take those kind of liberties that a scholar couldn't, is by far and away the richest sonic experience, that from an early text in English that we have.
Yeah, and of course that kind of thing eventually leads to Zhukovsky's experiments in translation, which isn't quite an extreme that you're going to in your translations, but
no, I'm really trying to just get the poem over. I don't. The business of taking liberties would require that one be a translator a lot more often than I am. If you did it daily and worked at it, I think you'd begin to feel so comfortable with the French that you would find. Give yourself permission.
But that does get to something I wanted to ask you about with regard to the effect it has on your own English. I know, to take one example, both Robert Bly and Clayton Eshelman have translated Cesar Vallejo, and in one of the poems that they both translated, there's the recurring Spanish monosyllable I, which is sort of like our O. A little mournful, not particularly semantically meaningful. That we would all immediately recognize. Now, Eshelman translated it throughout as the two-syllable English word alas, which is a pretty good solution to that problem, if you're not going to just say oh or but Bly stretched out to it is sad, which completely transforms the feeling of it. But that kind of problem gives you an attention towards the texture of your own language when you're trying to, once you've gotten into the French or the Spanish and turned around and look back at the English. Now, does that carry over into your own original composition at all?
Well, I think it probably, they're almost the exact same. You would do for your own poem what you would do for a translation, ideally. I mean, if you I would prefer the alas, and I don't even like alas very much. I would like to think that you could keep,
just keep
a nonsense
I,
of an I,
yeah.
And it's not a nonsense syllable because it signifies a certain degree of intensity or
mournful resignation or something. Yeah.
So, but we don't really have nonsense syllables in English that are built into poems. So, and like the Navajo and the chants of the Native American, who have great kind of resilience and understanding that sound, for its own sense, can hold its place in a syntactic run.
We did in lyrics in English up to a certain point in our history, and probably the only recent manifestation of anything like that was bebop's vocals. We've certainly gotten away from that.
Scat singing. In fact, very few people even sing scat. With the advent of the singer-songwriter, everything has to be, as kind of lyrically complete as possible. But I really, even listening to Ella Fitzgerald in the 50s, when she does a few choruses of How High the Moon and goes into scat, it's a complete pleasure.
Well, we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you to read one more poem for our audience. Again, we've been listening today on the Incognito Lounge on KSJS-FM to Geoffrey Young, who in addition to being a poet and a translator, is the publisher of the Figures Press. And again, if anyone in the audience is interested in trying to get hold of books from the Figures Press or books by Geoffrey Young, you can call me here at the station on 924-4488, and I'll try to track them down for you. Again, I want to thank you for coming by tonight on your way to San Francisco, and could you read just one more poem for us?
A poem called The Whale. You are naked in the stadium, pulling submarines out of your bra. Your lover throws socks on the traffic. I am under your necktie. This is Ronnie the cold cream speaking. I think the way you kiss my deaf ear. For what is a lighthouse but a passing ocean? And what is a half-empty glass but the smile that kills? Mountains walk on the flypaper. A dumb crook takes a fall. Whoever has the most photographs wins. Not bad. 7 months, 2 aspirin. A great meaning puts its fist through my steel plate door. Smart trees love the wind. I'll go the whole wide world for additional percussion. My left middle finger is throwing a fit.
I should point out that the title of one of your books is Subject to Fits.
That's right. Yeah. That was pretty close. I was worried about that at the time. Anyway, the next poem is called Decaf. And the final poem I'll read is called Cephariades. Cephariades is the Greek spelling of the poet George Sepharis' Greek name. So George Sepharis, who won the Nobel Prize in the early 60s, a terrific Greek poet. My father had sent me a book of his called Mythistorema, and I know I culled some of the lines from this poem out of that book. And then inevitably one leaches out what you don't want from that, and puts things in from one's own writing. And so this is called Cephariades, and I've dedicated it to my father. It's always uphill to the mountains, to the horizon, to the twilight sky. The buildings collapsed that might have been our homes. So much has passed before our eyes. Let's burn whatever light is left over from our childhood years, without hope of enjoying reward. A small pine tree in the red soil leading to another sea, gulls and seals. From harbor to harbor, our souls travel the decks of decayed ships in a country that is no longer ours. The sails give off only the smell of salt, the same as our love, the same as our bodies. white sails, broken oars, and sunlight at dawn finds us turning over in sleep. Let us follow the sun-struck poppy a little higher, we who have nothing to reach but the abrupt.
Great.